Hello, you're listening to the podcast Tangible Medical Education, where we'll be talking about medical education in Ukraine and in the world, and about the medical profession more generally. In this podcast, we try to highlight the intangible, which in reality makes medicine very tangible. Today, we have two wonderful guests from the United Kingdom, Reychel Klarick and Henry Marsh. Reychel is a palliative care doctor, but also formerly a journalist. And Henry is perhaps one of the best-known neurosurgeons in the world at this point, but also, as we found out today, formerly a PPE graduate. For those of you that aren't familiar with PPE, it's philosophy, politics, and economics. And our podcast is made possible by the Ukrainian-Swiss project called Medical Education Development. So, Dr. Clark, Dr. Marsh, welcome. When we were preparing today, we sort of talked a little bit about this, but both of you are authors. And both of you, it turns out between you, have now 6 books, which our Ukrainian audience will probably have heard of at least, if not read. Henry Marsh's Do No Harm and Admissions, and Finally, which is, as we found out, a book that actually goes into quantum mechanics a little bit.
Well, only sort of a little bit as a sort of joke. It's mainly about my being diagnosed with cancer during the pandemic, with advanced prostate cancer. And the story is about a doctor becoming a patient and the insights it gives you into your own life and your own practice in the past. Fantastic.
We'll talk about that a little bit, because normally we don't think of doctors as patients. And I think that that's something that certainly Ukrainian doctors would like to see themselves as somehow higher than their patients.
Exactly.
Status.
And that's what my book is partly about.
Wonderful. And we have Reychel, who has published a recent book called Breathtaking, which I understand is about COVID. And previous to that, we have Dear Life, which is, maybe you can tell us a bit about that one.
Yeah, so Dear Life has just been published in Ukraine, and it's about my work as a palliative care doctor, which is often seen as a branch of medicine that must be very depressing to work in, because all of the patients I work with have a terminal illness. They're often dying very close to death. But I wanted to write a book about working with those patients, and in particular in a hospice, which in the UK is a small kind of hospital unit that is filled with patients who are dying, because surprisingly, it's the very furthest thing from depressing. I absolutely love going to work every day. And I think that's because when people know their time is limited, when they're in close proximity to death, all of the stuff that doesn't matter just falls away, and only the things that really matter in life come to the fore. So all the things that are precious, the people you love, the things you love in the world, how do you ensure patients are able to experience as much of that as possible? That's a big part of the medicine that you practice in palliative medicine. So it's not just about drugs and interventions, it's about the human being and helping them live right up to the last day of their life.
Is that similar to transferring, I mean, the role transfer, if you like, from doctor to patient? I'm thinking what Henry has gone through as a patient. My understanding is that your cancer is in remission. So
for the time being, yes.
For the time being. So the point is that we're not, you're not someone that's in palliative care yet.
No. Well, I think one needs to explain palliative care and hospice care, which Reychel practices. A lot of the patients are young. These are not old people dying from old age. These are people dying from cancer, motor neuron disease, diseases like that, and often they're quite young. So it's not as old age care. It's quite different.
Ah, okay, because my sort of association was when you were speaking with geriatric medicine, if you like. So in other words, the concept of, people have Alzheimer's or at the final stages of their life, and you're trying to make them a little bit more, I guess, comfortable in their old age. But that's not what it's about.
No. So dying is not a medical condition. Dying is being mortal. We are all mortal. We're dying from the first day we're born.
Well, that's depressing.
Well, is it?
Well, is
because
it?
I think...
Is it?
finitude, if you remember that your days are numbered, then that hopefully will give you the impetus to make the most of them and cherish them. It's easy to become complacent and just assume life goes on forever and not notice the gorgeous sunset outside, or, you know, your daughter taking her first steps. But all these things are precious.
But doesn't that get us into a sort of a hedonistic ethic that, you know, you sort of, you try to get everything out of...
No, not at all. I mean, when I was diagnosed and realized actually it was a very serious cancer and probably life-limiting, on the one hand I felt panic-struck and I was terribly upset and frightened. But at the same time I thought, well, actually I've had an incredibly good life, a very complete life. And what counted, apart from my family and my wife, was... As a doctor, I've been so lucky I could help people. And the fact of the matter is the greatest happiness in life, in my experience, is not my own happiness, it's making other people happy. It's helping other people. And this is one of the great privileges in theory we have as doctors. It's not hedonistic, in my opinion.
It's really interesting. I talk to people on their deathbeds regularly, every day at work. And when people talk about what matters to them right at the end, nobody ever says, God, I wish I'd worked harder. I wish I'd had...
Well, I wish I had more money in my bank account.
None of that matters. It's all about, have I been good to my wife? Are my children happy? You know, how incredible that I have grandchildren who love me. I feel a sense of pride that I did something decent in the world. I made my little contribution to the world. And it's incredibly inspiring to work with people like that, because all the best things about human beings, you know, people are by and large good, they're courageous, they're generous. That's what you see in these most difficult of circumstances. People are brave when it comes to the end.
We don't like to talk about death. This is something. I mean, I would assume that it's not just a Ukrainian thing. It's this is probably a generally typically human thing that
I think it is. We're all terrified of it. I think it's deeply innate. As I said, when I learned my diagnosis, I was terrified, right. Which is a bit ridiculous, given that as a doctor and a neurosurgeon, I've been dealing every day with death and serious illnesses. And yet when it was my turn, I still felt sort of shocked. I felt surprised.
Is that perhaps, I'm sorry, I have to ask you this. Are you religious?
No.
Nope.
Okay.
Atheist.
Well, maybe that's why there's a sort of a panic, because it ends. That's it. We're
people have done some research on whether religion helps people in their final illnesses. I don't think there are any very clear answers. And of course, if you believe in an afterlife, I know that now in America, opinion surveys, nobody believes in hell. They only believe in heaven. But historically, and I discuss this in my new book, And Finally, there was a well-known book written about the Great Plague in 1666 by Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. People dying from the plague died in terrible spiritual agony if they hadn't made their confession. Mm-hmm. And they were telling other people, you know, make sure you confess, because otherwise you'll go to hell. Mm. And we don't have to. Having a belief in an afterlife in theory is not necessarily reassuring.
Well, I'm thinking, actually, in a previous podcast, we talked a little bit about the concept of the doctor in literature and how it's changed over time. And I remember one of the things I mentioned that with it was a podcast with Bonan and the Burak. I mentioned my experience of having gone to University of Milan, which is a university which is actually housed in a former hospital from the 16th century.
But Filaretti.
But effectively, it's a beautiful, beautiful building, architecturally, et cetera, but effectively this was a place where people went to die. It was not a place where people went to be cared for. This was a dying factory sort of thing. And the role of doctor at that point was basically palliative, wasn't it?
Well, the design of that particular building was designed by a famous architect called Filaretti. Was essentially like a church, mm-hmm. and it was designed in a cruciform form.
That's right.
So all of the dying sick patients could see the Mass being celebrated at the cross. Yes, the word hospital is from spittle, which means a place of hospitality and care. Mm-hmm. But that was a long time ago. Medicine has changed.
Well, that's the thing. Medicine has changed, and I think that our image of doctor is the person that is supposed to help us not die.
Exactly. And this is a huge problem. So at medical school, you're not really taught about human beings. You're taught about body parts, what each body part does, how it goes wrong, and how you fix it. So you learn a lot about how to treat livers and hearts and kidneys, but you don't necessarily learn very much about how to treat a human being. And of course, from the perspective of being a patient, and doctors are patients and often learn a lot of humility when we are patients, what you really want from your doctor isn't just technical expertise, although that's very, very useful, particularly if someone's delving into your brain, as Henry has spent his life doing. You want someone who has some humanity and compassion, can empathize with you, appreciate that coming into hospital or being diagnosed with a serious illness is devastating. It disrupts your whole biography in hospital. You have a name band round your wrist. You have to wear a hospital gown. You're dehumanized. You're poked. You're prodded. Your orifices are invaded. It's scary. It's profoundly scary. And if, as a doctor, you can't appreciate that, and you are unable, or you fail to show care and attention to your patients, then actually you're performing them a grave disservice. And palliative medicine has a reputation within all the medical specialties of trying very, very hard to make the human being the centre of the decision-making. So the key question is, what matters to you, this individual patient? Okay, but how do we bring this together sort of on one page with the fact that we've got a neurosurgeon in front of us sitting in this conversation that, quite frankly, like every other surgeon, probably recognizes the scan, in other words, the brain scan that you're going to be operating on, or if it's a cardiac surgeon, then the EKG or whatever. The point is that you don't necessarily, I mean, be honest, Henry, do you remember your patients? Do you recognize them on the streets? Do you really see them as human?
I remember an awful lot of my failures. I forget the successes. And when I was diagnosed with cancer, I went through a period when all sorts of deeply repressed memories were flooding up of all the patients I felt had failed in one way or another. But another way of looking at this is, and many senior surgeons in other branches would say the same, the operating is easy. Once you've learnt it, operating isn't very difficult. Exactly. You scowl a bit when you hear that. You can't believe that. You're so brainwashed into thinking that operating surgery are like gods. It's not.
I'm thinking brainwashed from a neurosurgeon. Yeah. That one's an interesting concept.
Once you've learnt how to operate, what you realize is the really difficult bit is the decision-making and getting on with colleagues and getting on with patients. And that's where mistakes arise. Because most medical decisions are not binary. They're not yes or no, black or white. There are lots of shades of grey. When you have to make any medical decision, whether it's an operation or prescribing a drug, what you're saying implicitly is, what are the risks of treatment? What are the benefits of treatment? What are the risks of no treatment? What are the risks of no treatment and benefits? And then actually these aren't facts, these are probabilities. And we have to constantly juggling with all these uncertainties. And that's where the mistakes arise. I made more mistakes by operating than I shouldn't have done, or doing the wrong type of operation. The idea that it's about steady hands and, gosh, millimetre away from causing irreversible brain damage. It's incredibly unusual to make a purely sort of technical, practical mistake. And I tell the story in my new book about how I once operated on the wrong side. The patient didn't come to harm. I came to harm, but in a sense.
I'm sorry, but the wrong side of the brain?
Wrong side of the neck.
Okay.
But that's an example of, it's a decision. All my worst mistakes.
They came to slight harm. They did have an incision in the wrong side of their neck.
No, it's a midline incision. But this is where the problems arise. And there's no question of the fact. I've worked all over the world, and the really difficult bit of brain surgery is the decision-making. The operating is easy.
You talk a lot in your book about and in the various interviews that you've done, and I would certainly encourage people that are listening to us today to sort of Google Henry Marshem and look at some of the things, including sort of hard talk interviews with Stephen Sacker and many of the other lectures that you've given. You talk a lot about mistakes.
Yeah.
That makes you very different,
yes.
Meaning that doctors, particularly surgeons, don't like to talk about their mistakes. I mean, I had a very good friend of mine who's a surgeon, and he has a joke. He says, what's the difference between God and a surgeon? And the answer, of course, is that God knows for sure that he's not a surgeon. Surgeons are not convinced that they may not be God. So, of course, when you've got this God complex amongst surgeons, gods don't make mistakes. And here you are publicly talking about the
yes.
fact that you've been careless.
Yes.
Why? I mean, you're
because you can only make progress with patient safety if you're open about making mistakes. Some people think my books have been confessions. They're not confessions, because I've reconciled myself to my mistakes. It's trying to set an example. An enormous number of mistakes are made in medicine. I mean, people are showing figures. Thousands of people suffer from what are called millions of people suffer from iatrogenic mistakes made by doctors. And you can only reduce mistakes if you admit to them and learn from them. Mm-hmm. This is the talk of a learning culture, things like that. And the reason why so many doctors find it very hard to admit to making mistakes is firstly because you need if you do dangerous surgery, as I did, you need a lot of self-confidence. If you go into the operating room shaking like a leaf, you can't do the work. And also,
in other words, the God complex actually does help.
It helps, but all power corrupts. Mm. And as the great historian Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And in some ways, as surgeons, particularly things like brain surgery, we have absolute power of life over death over our patients. And it's very easy to get corrupted. And then you start making mistakes because your guard is down, you believe yourself too much, and you forget the fact you're a fallible human being. And you are going to make mistakes. We all do.
In medical school, we're taught not to make mistakes, meaning that if you make a mistake, you get a lower grade at the end of the day. You can fail a course if you make mistakes on the exam. And so the whole idea is that we're teaching doctors to not make mistakes, and if they do make mistakes, then to cover them up. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that we need to, is the British system different from that?
No, unfortunately, it's exactly the same in that respect. So not only are you penalised for making mistakes, so that's teaching you that mistakes are a bad thing, but you're also taught typically by many senior doctors who unintentionally present to students an example of an authoritative, confident, seemingly infallible professional who is not overtly racked by self-doubt or wrestling with difficult decisions, and crucially also not affected by the emotional aspects of being a doctor. So if you're a doctor, you are of necessity immersed in a world of pain, suffering, human beings in extremis, death, dying. Those are all difficult things to confront day in, day out. But if you are taught your profession by people who appear to just take all of that in their stride, then you, as a young student, feel that not only are mistakes a bad thing, but emotion is a bad thing as well. And you mustn't exhibit it, and probably you mustn't feel it as well. If you do feel emotion, then somehow you are failing as a doctor. And that also is really dangerous, because one of the very hardest things in medicine when you are navigating that course, that decision-making course with a patient that Henry describes, how should I intervene? What degree of intervention is right? It's the challenge of trying to strike a balance between detachment and empathy. So we need to empathise with patients. We have to be able to feel to some extent what they're going through, or inhumane as doctors.
But not too much.
But not too much. Yeah. Because if you are overwhelmed with emotion, then you're not going to restart that patient's heart. You're going to dither at the bedside instead. So how do you strike that balance, walk that tightrope between empathy and detachment? No one teaches it.
Yeah. And the other point, which is a terribly profound truth, but nobody ever told me this, and I don't know anybody else who's ever actually said this openly, there is nothing more frightening for a patient than a frightened doctor. Mm-hmm. It's terrifying. And you just learn that instinctively as soon as you become a doctor. I have to hide my feelings. Because when you're a young doctor, it often is frightening. You're suddenly responsible for other people's lives. Yes, you're part of a hierarchy, you've got a boss, but, giving potentially lethal injections if you write up the wrong drug, it's scary. Sudden, intense responsibility. But you must not show your fear. It's terribly important to pretend to be as competent and confident as your patients desperately need you to be. And, of course, the best way of deceiving other people is to deceive yourself. Mm-hmm. And so self-deception is a necessary clinical skill, but it can easily corrupt you as you move up the medical ladder.
Which moves us into this whole concept of bias, right? Because if you've got internal biases that you're hiding, right? Yeah. And one of the things that I find it actually fascinating reading and reading and listening to your interviews, because you take this concept of that. Frankly, we had an economist by the name of Kahneman who was talking about biases.
Well, he's a psychologist, but he got the Nobel Prize for economics.
Right. Yeah. And here we are talking about this in biases in medicine. Yeah. And, I guess the way around...
Well, that bias is in thinking, and we all have to think, whether we're a brain surgeon or a truck driver or whatever.
So the way to get around these biases, I guess, is to talk them through.
Yes, and you have to talk them through with somebody else. If you talk them through with yourself... If you're careful, you take time, you're less likely to make mistakes, but you'll still end up your judgment. As I said, when you have to decide whether to operate or not, you're estimating probabilities. And the commonest mistake in medicine for surgeons who want to operate, and if it's private medicine, they want to make money, is unconsciously you'll overestimate the risks of not operating and underestimate the risks of operating. Now, you're not wrong. These are probabilities. Mm-hmm. It's like a weather forecast. The weather forecast is never wrong. If you say it's a 99% chance of rain and then it doesn't rain, well, I said there was a 1% chance, So it's these sort of unconscious biases which distort our decision-making. And the only way you can reduce that risk is having good colleagues.
So you don't talk this through, obviously, with your patients, because with your patients you need to present an image.
Yes and no. No, it's not. No, I just like Rachel was saying, but good medical decision making. You make decisions with patients, not for patients.
Mm. So the person who actually should be making these decisions, all of these decisions, is the person who is going to be operated on, or whatever the intervention is. It's the patient. And the job of the doctor is not to do the decision making.
It's to advise.
It's to advise. It's to present the information to a patient, talk it through with them.
It's interesting because in Britain you actually call doctors consultants, which we certainly don't do in Ukraine. Yes. It's definitely not a consultant. The doctor is someone that is higher up.
Some patients don't want to make the decision. You accept that. If some patients want to be told more or less, this is what will be done, ... But it changes. As patients become more educated, they expect more to be involved in the decision-making.
And the real danger of not involving patients in the decision-making is you, as the doctor, the paternalistic doctor, make assumptions about what the patient will or will not want, and you're probably doing that from your own set of personal biases. So I'm a young, healthy, fit doctor. Clearly, life would be intolerable. It would be not worth living if I had a diagnosis of end-stage motor neurone disease, and therefore, of course, this patient will not want any interventions to prolong their life because their life must be insufferable. How about asking the patient? Because you might find that despite all the disabilities of their illness, they love their life, it's full of richness, and you've just written them off from your position of health.
What you're talking about, there's this wonderful word called empathy. Effectively, what you're talking about is empathy. It's the ability to relate, if you like, to the feelings and the reality of life of the patient. Can you teach this?
Well, I don't want to get too sort of hair-splitting about this, but strictly speaking, empathy means to actually feel yourself what somebody else feels.
Right.
Now, in the strict sense, that means every time you stick a needle into somebody to take their blood, if you feel it yourself, as you would if it's somebody you love or your own child, you would flinch. So it's sort of empathy, but some people would call it sympathy or understanding or compassion. And it has to be circumscribed and bounded to some extent, as Rachel was saying earlier. You have to find a path between being kind and compassionate and being detached, and that's really very difficult sometimes.
But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, for me, empathy is, I would say, sympathy is feeling someone else's emotions. Compassion is literally suffering with another human being. Empathy is an imaginative leap. It's trying to get into someone else's shoes, imagine what it's like for them. And if you imagine you're a busy, exhausted doctor, you've been on your feet for 12 hours, it takes work, effort, empathy, doesn't it?
Empathy hurts.
It's much easier to not go there, to not try and understand what it's like for a patient. And when you're tired and busy and stressed and in a chaotic emergency department, everything pushes you into being unempathetic. And also being cold and closed off is a way of protecting yourself. If you keep yourself behind armour, you're less likely to get hurt by your job. So there are all these pressures encouraging and pushing doctors into being hard as nails, potentially to the detriment of their patients.
And the more dangerous and invasive, in my case, surgery you practice, in some ways, the more you will tend to block yourself off to protect yourself.
I'm thinking that the reason that the two of you have this, I guess, mission, I'm getting the impression that it's a bit of a mission of spreading the idea of medicine is about treating humans as opposed to treating organs, which incidentally is I think a universal problem that medical professionals will tend to treat organs rather than.
We're not exactly the first people to argue for what's called holistic medicine.
But I think there's a lot of stereotypes about the concept of holistic medicine. You're talking about treating humans, and I think that I get the impression that one of the reasons that you're talking about this is because you weren't always doctors. In other words, you were trained before becoming doctors. You had studied other things. In Henry's and your, and in Rachel's case, you've both had training and you've both studied, my understanding is at Oxford, politics, philosophy, economics. Is that the reason that we're talking about human beings? Because then you went into medical school and you learned all about organs.
Yeah. I mean, in my case, so I'd had 10 years professionally asking questions, difficult questions as a journalist, and also finding out everything there was to know about other people in the world. So that was the background I went into medicine with. And I remember vividly over and over again in medical school being horrified by the way some of the doctors I encountered treated their patients. And because I had that 10-year background, I would speak out. I wouldn't just meekly sort of scuttle around. And medicine is terribly hierarchical, and medical students are the lowest of the low in many ways. They get bullied by everybody, all the doctors, the nurses, everyone in the hospital bullies the little medical students. But I would just stand up and say, no, this is wrong. And I remember once this very eminent professor of neurology in Oxford's main hospital wanted us to go, a little group of medical students, to see a patient because she had her neurological condition that was going to kill her in a few weeks had such incredibly exotic signs. He wanted us all to go and poke and prod her and elicit these signs. And I'd happened to see this woman that morning and chatted to her, and she absolutely said, I cannot endure another round of medical students. Every doctor in the hospital is coming to prod me because I'm so exotic. Please don't let them. And she started to cry. So I said, okay. And then sure enough, my professor said, right, come on, we're going to go and see Mrs. Smith in bed 8. And I said, no. I've spoken to her this morning. She doesn't want any medical students. And he rounded on me and said, what are you talking about? Shouting and raving. And I just stood there and said, no, absolutely not. And interestingly, even though he was livid, at the end of our ward round, where all the other students were saying, "Why did you do that, Rachel? You're going to fail your course." He came up to me very, very quietly and said out of a corner of his mouth, "I've thought about what you said. Thank you. Never mention it again."
And why he was angry?
Yeah.
Because he was torn.
Yes.
Anger is always... If you're angry, it means you're frightened of something.
Yeah.
There's a conflict.
My question is, does every good doctor have to be a philosopher? In other words, is philosophy something that we have? Again, we get back into the education bit. With education in medical school, we're talking about organs, we're talking about anatomy, we're talking about pharmacology, we're talking about chemistry, all of the things that we need to treat a particular condition. How do we get doctors to be more human? Is it about sort of going back to the classics? Because quite frankly, in Ukrainian medical schools, we do teach philosophy, but it's something that we go through because we have to go through it rather than having to actually live these thoughts and live these ideas. Has your PPE, Henry, helped you be a better neurosurgeon, or is it completely irrelevant?
I think it's probably completely irrelevant in terms of the actual factual knowledge and study. But it taught me to think, to think critically. That was, I think, the point. And there are two sides to a case, things like that. It also taught me to write, because I had to write 2 essays every week for 3 years. But the actual... Actually, I dropped philosophy after 1 year, because philosophy at Oxford 50 years ago was all just linguistic analysis and logical positivism, no metaphysics or ethics, boring as hell. So when I took up brain surgery, I called it practical metaphysics. So the answer is, I don't think PPE per se, by itself, made me a better doctor, but the experience of being older. And I had 3 years doing different jobs. I did Peace Corps in Africa and did all sorts of things. Worked as a psychogeriatric nursing assistant for long-term geriatric wrecks. All that, I think, helped. Mm-hmm. And then my son had a brain tumor at the age of 3 months and survived. And that helped, I think, a lot as well. I was already a young doctor by then. Experience. It's just experience of life makes you a better doctor. Mm-hmm. And if you go straight into medical school from high school at the age of 17, you have a very, very limited view of life. Mm-hmm. And everything you see from then on is wearing the blinkers of, I'm a doctor, patients are them, I am part of the medical profession, us. And I think that's very damaging.
There is I don't know if this is correct or not, but there is there's a certain group of people, let's just put it that way, that believe in Ukraine that the way we humanize medicine, the way we have better care for patients, the way we get to the point that patients will be treated not as a collection of organs, but actually as individuals, is by making it private, because these people will then be paying for it. And obviously, doctors will be financially incentivized to treat customers rather than patients. You both have been very public about the fact that you are adamantly pro-socialized medicine. Why?
Very simply, when we go to work in Britain, we have a National Health Service, tax funded, no one pays for anything. The only thing we have to think about is what is in the best interests of the patient in front of us. Our decision making, it may be clouded by our personal biases, as we've been discussing, but the one thing it isn't biased by is profit motive. Henry or I do not conduct a surgery or prescribe a drug because we are going to profit from it. And the idea that a doctor whose whole calling and profession is about helping people in need of healthcare, the idea that we would be influenced by our own personal enrichment, I find just abhorrent. Patients are vulnerable. There are socioeconomic gradients in health. So if you are poor, you are more likely to be sick. I don't want to inhabit a society that is rich. Britain is a rich country, and
bits of it are.
Bits of it are. and yet decides collectively that we are not willing to fund good quality healthcare for our most vulnerable and most poor citizens. You know, the essence of a civilized country is how well it treats its most vulnerable members, and healthcare is a crucial part of that. It's just the profit motive in medicine is disastrous. It results in overtreatment, bureaucracy, and suddenly doctors are making decisions according to what benefits shareholders, not patients.
Well, I mean, we can argue about the fact that it's not about the profit motive, but what it is about is the fact that those of us that have the means, the money to pay for better care, are forced to get the same kind of care as someone who's poor, and that actually is reflected in the concept of how doctors will relate to patients. In other words, you're relating to patients as all equal. It doesn't matter if you've got money, if you don't have money, what status you are, if you're a professor or if you're a gardener, you're going to get the same care. That means that what we're doing is we are in fact treating organs, because the organs don't matter if they're in a gardener or in a professor. If we want to be dealing with someone who is really human, then perhaps we should differentiate some way. And the private medicine is a way of differentiating.
But you're suggesting that payment is the thing that's going to make doctors treat human beings as human beings. And I would suggest that the fundamental problem at the moment with medical education is simply, it's not that we're not teaching doctors to go into a profit-based system, it's that we are not placing the patient experience at the centre of medical education. So we don't need to privatise Britain's National Health Service. What we need to do in medical education is place the patient at the centre. So, for example, the best and most powerful way to teach empathy in medical students and young doctors is to get them to hear from patients. If you can't bring a patient right there into the lecture theatre, film them, film interviews, hear a patient saying, I wanted to die when my doctor told me I had a brain tumour, because the way he spoke to me made me feel like I was trash. I was something to be thrown into a rubbish bin. That's something a patient once told me. If you don't put the patient's experience at the centre of medical education, you produce doctors who don't get it, who haven't got the tools, the ability to be humane doctors. You just teach differently, and then everything else follows.
I mean, there are drawbacks with socialised healthcare. There are drawbacks with private healthcare. The main problem with private healthcare is the patient becomes the means to an end. The patient is no longer the end. And this is corrupting. It need not be corrupting. If you have very high ethical standards, doctors will not be corrupted by the fact they're making money. But I mean, look at the American system. It's a complete car crash in terms of public health. And it's not just the doctors, it's the hospitals who are trying to make money.
And the insurance companies.
So I mean, and the problem with socialised healthcare is you can be a lousy doctor, but the patients still come and see you. And I agree, there's nothing like waving money in front of doctors' noses to make them respond more quickly. I had to wait 3 weeks before I knew the results of all the scans which showed whether I had a widespread metastatic disease or not. If I had gone privately, which I didn't do, I'm sure I would have been rung up within 24 hours of a scan. So, I mean, it's a balance, as of all these things. But if, as Rachel says, if you think that, I agree with her, that the sign of a civilized, humane society is how we care for the most vulnerable people, you're much more likely to get that with a more or less socialized healthcare system than a commercial one. And all healthcare systems reflect their underlying society. Look at Scandinavia. High taxation, very low levels of inequality, very effective healthcare systems, and a very good stats. Look at America, hugely unequal society, terrible healthcare system. And England, I'm afraid, is heading that way as well.
Well, the three of us come from backgrounds of having socialized. I mean, I grew up in Canada, which is obviously has a very sort of similar system, I think, to the British NHS, if I'm not mistaken.
More or less, but surgeons are paid on a piece rate basis. So it's a bit different in some ways.
Okay, but the Ukrainian system is obviously very different. Formally we have socialized medicine, which is supposed to be, according to the Constitution anyway, available to everyone equally. But in reality, we also have private practices, and we have a very differentiated system whereby we have private hospitals and private care. And it's obviously very different in terms of service and in terms of, my argument, or perhaps not my argument, but the reason I'm asking the questions is because having gone through both, in other words, having in Ukraine the experience of a state-run clinic and hospital and then going to a private medical facility, the difference in service is, night and day.
Yeah, I know. I've seen all this. I've been to some of the new private hospitals in Kiev. They're as good as anything in the West. I've been working in state hospitals here as well. They're absolutely terrible. It's very difficult in Ukraine. And it's also because ultimately Ukraine is a poor country, So, and again, the inequality is even more oligarchic than Russia. So it's huge inequality and relatively poor. So it does make it very, very difficult.
Can I ask the two of you a non-medical question? This is more of a personal question. What are you doing here? I've sort of moved the conversation a little bit towards talking about Ukraine. I get that question a lot, obviously, because I've been living here for 20 years, and my background is Ukrainian. My parents emigrated to Canada as refugees, as refugee children during the war, during the Second World War, and I grew up in Canada, and I've spent my life in the Ukrainian diaspora community. And 20 years ago, I decided, after receiving some education in Britain, to move here and make a life here. So I have some roots and I have some contacts, and obviously I find this country to be very exciting, and this is now home for me after 20 years and 4 kids, Kyiv is very much sort of, even though I'm not what we call korінний киянин, in other words, not someone who was born and raised in Kyiv. Kyiv is home, Lviv is my second home. But you are not the same.
Well, Rachel's here, but it's mainly because of me, so I will answer that question. My mother was a political refugee from Nazi Germany. She had to leave Germany in a rush in 1939 because the Gestapo were more or less after her. And in effect, my father, who was an English lawyer, had gone to Germany and met her. And he'd gone to learn German, in effect married her so she could get out of Germany. It was a very successful marriage. And my father was one of the early international human rights lawyers. My parents were among the small group of people who founded Amnesty International. So I grew up with this very strong background of human rights, making the world a better place, and a deep interest and awareness of Central Europe. My mother came from Magdeburg. And it was kind of automatic because it was an Oxford act. My father was an Oxford professor for a while. It was kind of automatic. I went to Oxford, read PP. I couldn't do science at school because it was so rigid, the system, in the 1950s. So I went up to Oxford, having spent 2 years away, partly in Africa, teaching, and mainly studied Soviet politics because I was just terribly interested by totalitarianism. I studied under a very eminent guy called Archie Brown, who introduced Margaret Thatcher to Gorbachev. Then, for reasons that needn't detain us, I strayed into brain surgery. And then, purely by chance, in 1992, I was asked by an English businessman who was trying to sell, or trader, who was hoping to sell medical kits of a newly independent Ukraine, to come out to Kiev, or Kiev, as it was then, because there was one of the 2 big Soviet neurosurgical hospitals, the Institute of Neurosurgical Research in Kiev. So I came out, and although I knew things would be bad, I was just staggered at the situation in the hospitals I was taken to visit. That's extraordinary. 50 years out of date and empty. Mm-hmm. And I met a very, very dynamic, almost aggressive young neurosurgeon who said, everything is terrible here, will you help? And I said, well, you can come out to London and study under me. In those days, the National Health Service, I could bring anybody over they could work with. Now it's all very bureaucratic and very difficult to bring visiting doctors over. So he came, he was absolutely dedicated, worked incredibly hard. And we started working together. I'd go out to Kiev once or twice a year. I'd drive from London to Kiev.
Drive?
Yeah, with lots of second-hand medical kits. And well, then he'd meet me in Lviv or Poznan, what we would drive on across. So, and I took out loads of second-hand medical equipment. It was amazing how helpful people were. And I'd go around all the hospitals and private hospitals in London saying, have you got any old second-hand microscopes and things like that? And he became pretty famous in Ukraine. But alas, as he became more famous, he got kind of a bit corrupted by his success. And I realized he was morphing like an animal farm into the various autocratic Soviet professors who'd only teach their son. There's a Ukrainian professor's son, postgraduate medical system, education system.
We call it dynasties.
Yeah. No, the Soviet medicine was very nepotistic, and it still is here, I think. And eventually I had to part company with him. I now work on a very loose level with younger doctors. But the point of the story is this, that I recognized somehow deep within myself, because of my background and my training in Kremlinology, that something special was going on in Ukraine. I saw a country on its knees in 1992, economically and socially, and yet you had this feeling there was all these green shoots and mushrooms struggling to come up. So come the Orange Revolution, even more so come Maidan, and I was at Maidan. I got my little ribbon at Maidan. I wasn't there on the day everybody got shot, but in retrospect, I claim to be very prescient. I never expected there to be a war. Who did? But for me, Ukraine is the watershed. It's where Eastern despotism meets Western freedom, and I really feel is not empty words, that the fight against Putin, and not just Putin, but his whole gang and too many people in Russia, really is a fight for civilization and Western liberal values. And it's hugely important. And I felt in my own little way, by helping Ukrainian doctors, although with my main colleague in a sense it didn't work, was my contribution. You know, I could help a little bit. And what I was trying to do wasn't really, my colleague thought it was all technical, instrumental, I was showing him how to operate. What I thought I was trying to teach was openness, discussion, evidence-based, not expert opinion-based. And I failed with him. But with other guys, I didn't, I think. And I'm terribly pleased to see the people I now liaise with. They're much better at teamwork. They discuss cases together. I brought out some kit with me on this visit, quite expensive stuff I bought from a charitable fund I have. And to give to my friend who works in the private sector here, it shows how complicated everything is. But he promises he will share the kit with other colleagues. So, yeah, there's progress. But for me, it's a young country. There's so much. Now, it's wonderful to bring Reychel here, who can preach the message of palliative care and humanity in medicine. And she's a wonderful advocate for it.
You're so idealistic.
Well, why not? You know,
look, idealistic, but at the same time, I think that it's interesting because you're seeing the same opportunities. I mean, I get asked constantly, Mihайло, 20 years you've been living here. Why are you here? It's because of the fact that you're obviously, patriotic and serving, et cetera, et cetera. And my attitude is no. This is a country of opportunity.
Exactly.
This is about self-actualization. Sort of the highest level of
and to see the new generation of young Ukrainians who are so smart and so smart. It's wonderful.
Reychel?
Yeah, so really simple. When Henry talked to me about coming out, it was just...
It's quite a long time ago.
Yeah, we've been... Before the invasion, we've been talking about it, and we were going to come out the week of the 24th of February, weren't we? Yeah. And I just see...
You were actually supposed to be going to Kharkiv, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I was supposed to be going to Kharkiv, yeah.
Okay. Right. Which is, yeah.
So to be coming now is such a privilege. I do a lot of teaching and training in the UK. I'm always trying to use every opportunity to teach the importance of humane medicine. And to be coming out here and doing that, it is an absolute privilege. We've, in the UK, we follow the news of what's happening on a day-by-day basis. It's covered exhaustively in the media, and we're all sort of gripped and horrified by what's happening. And to be standing up yesterday in front of a room of medical students, who are so young, they're maybe in their late teens, early 20s.
And they asked question after question. It was wonderful. And she was wonderful. It was inspiring. Thirst
for learning. It's just an incredible opportunity to try and help practically in some tiny little way. And it's also just a joy and a privilege for me to see.
We've been talking a little bit about some of the themes that are in your books. I'm very pleased about the fact that we're ending today's podcast with actually some of the themes. Henry was mentioning about the fact that this is a place where Ukraine is a place where sort of authoritarianism is fighting against freedom and liberalism and that sort of thing. And obviously, this is one of the things that actually I've written about in my book on the Maidan and Ukraine's war against Russia, and that this is in fact a war about values. It's not necessarily just about territory.
It's just like my work over the years, although technically it was about how to operate on the brain. What I really felt was I was trying to convey values about evidence, about working, teamwork, things like that. What's remarkable is how I failed so spectacularly in some ways. The whole whole self-deception business. You go on trying. You know, persistence.
Persistence is, I think, that one of the most important qualities of being human, and that's something that I think we talked about today, which I very much appreciate. I want to thank both of you for taking the time today and for this discussion. This was actually very, very interesting. I want to thank our listeners. We had the privilege today of talking with Dr. Reychel Clark and Dr. Henry Marsh, and my name is Mihайло Винницький, and you've been listening to Tangible Medical Education. Hopefully some of the things that we've been talking about today, which are obviously very intangible, things like values and humanity and how we deal with each other, are obviously very sort of, I think, philosophical concepts, but they are reflected in something that's very, very tangible, and that is in our daily practice as medical practitioners, as students, as teachers, and I guess as patients as well. Thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.